In the first verse of the book of Ecclesiastes, the author identifies himself as the son of David and a king in Israel. So that kind of narrows it down, doesn't it? A son of David and a king in Israel sort of narrows down the author to Solomon. Now, I want you to notice this. I didn't put it on the screen, but I might have it in your outline of your lesson. I can't remember. Solomon wrote 3 books, and we believe they were penned at 3 very different times in his life. He wrote the Song of Songs, which we will look at a little later today. It's a passionate love story brimming with romance and energy and sensuality, emphasizing the devotion between a bridegroom and his bride. We believe that he likely wrote that when he was a younger man, just as when a younger man is more likely to take on a new bride. Proverbs, the second book Solomon wrote, a collection of profound sayings written by one who had observed life. We've spent the last 2 weeks in Proverbs, and so you know them as sort of these wisdom sound bites that are very practical and profound. We believe that Solomon wrote most of the Proverbs through his life, but collected them into this one book at midlife. And then comes Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes, the passionate love of youth, is gone. Even the practicality of middle-age wisdom deteriorates into a sort of tired cynicism. And so, the book of Ecclesiastes is, quite frankly, a cynical book. And you might imagine most scholars think it was written very late in his life, after sin and its consequences had gotten a grip on his life. So I'll set up Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon by saying it that way. Have you ever eaten too much at an all-you-can-eat buffet? Or maybe on Thanksgiving Day, eating too much. Have you ever eaten too much on Thanksgiving Day and you walk away from the table and you think, I am not eating again until Sunday? And then there you are, Thursday night, slipping back in the refrigerator, getting another shot at the turkey, you know. You see, it's so enjoyable while you are indulging, or as we call it, pigging out. But then later, there's a great price to be paid. The all-you-can-eat lifestyle is the diet of most gorging Americans these days. And there's so much to eat, and I'm talking about things, materialism, that it's hard not to get caught up in the secular culture's values, which eventually leads to overstuffing and spiritual heartburn. We live in such a pleasure-crazed culture, and yet we've never been unhappier, we've never been more anxious. For whatever reason, all the devices, all the technology, all the stuff, all the materialistic gains, all of the money has not made us happier, given us more satisfaction or more meaning. In fact, it has brought us record highs of anxiety, boredom, greed, cynicism, and an ever-increasing disillusionment that something is not quite right. Well, see, Solomon had all those things too. He was the wealthiest man in the world. He was the wisest man in the world. So he should have been the happiest man in the world. And if you've ever read Ecclesiastes, you know he wasn't. he experienced this same kind of bloated stuffiness nearly 3,000 years ago, to the point where his taste buds for life were numbed and could no longer be stimulated. So in the second verse, he tells us where he's coming from. He didn't even get past the second verse to sort of give us the synopsis and where he's coming from. Everything is meaningless. Completely meaningless. Now there's a nice start, isn't it? Doesn't that make you eager to read the book? But surely that can't always be true. Surely there is something that makes life satisfying and worth living. From the cradle to the grave, life is a search for meaning and satisfaction. And Solomon's journal near the end of his life is a good opportunity for us to learn from his mistakes and his wisdom in our own personal journey toward true meaning and lasting satisfaction. So as Solomon writes this journal called Ecclesiastes, he begins a search through much of life to find meaning and satisfaction. And he starts with wisdom or knowledge. Is ultimate meaning found in wisdom or knowledge? He's the wisest man in the world. Would do him well to know that, wouldn't it? Well, he said, "Look, I am wiser than any of the kings who ruled in Jerusalem before me. I have greater wisdom and knowledge than any of them. So I set out to learn everything from wisdom to madness and folly. But I learned firsthand that pursuing all this is like chasing the wind. The greater my wisdom, the greater my grief. To increase knowledge only increases sorrow." Well, that's true to an extent, is it not? Can you imagine having more wisdom than anybody else in the whole world and still not being happy? That was Solomon, who described it as chasing after the wind. He went on and said, "I said to myself, since I will end up the same as the fool, what's the value of all my wisdom? This is also meaningless, for the wise and the foolish both die. The wise will not be remembered any longer than the fool. In the days to come, both will be forgotten. So I came to hate life because everything done here under the sun is so troubling." Here we go again. You're going to see this term over and over in Ecclesiastes. Everything is meaningless, like chasing the wind. Oh yeah, why is that? Why are wisdom and knowledge meaningless, like chasing after the wind, do not really bring us ultimate meaning or satisfaction? Well, because we tend to rely, when we think we're wise, when we think we've got the answers, we tend to rely on self rather than God. And so puffed up with pride, we forget that even our wisdom, even all of our mental capacities or our gifts, they even came from God. And we forget that we have limitations to our knowledge. Despite our miraculous advances in education and technology, there are still areas in which our wisest and most educated people are unlearned and ignorant. There are still things that people do not know. In fact, most of the questions that God asked Job when he was searching still have not been answered today. Let's just take the first one. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? So I watched a fascinating interview about a week ago on TV. I just stumbled upon it. I was looking for something else on YouTube, but it came up on the screen, and so I thought, I got to watch this. It was Piers Morgan Live having an interview with Richard Dawkins, who has become the world's most famous atheist. He replaced Madalyn Murray O'Hair a few years ago as the world's most famous atheist. About 15 years ago, he wrote a book called The God Delusion, and he has gone around to college campuses and written 3 or 4 books about atheism and so on. Well, he's now in his 80s. And so Piers Morgan did an hour interview with him, and I watched the whole thing, and it was fascinating because he is starting to slowly change a little bit. And he said, well, I'm more not really an atheist anymore as I am agnostic. I just don't know. And Piers Morgan, who is a Catholic, kept pressing him on what he doesn't know. As a scientist, what he doesn't know. And it was amazing. You should watch it. It was amazing what all he doesn't know. But the main thing he doesn't know is how it all started. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? He said, I have no idea, and I don't think in my lifetime we'll even come close to an answer. He said, I have no idea. It was a fascinating discussion all the way through, but he didn't even know the basic question. Who determined its dimensions and stretched out the surveying lines? Who supports its foundations? Well, we still don't know that. We still don't know hardly any of the questions that God asked Job way back when. The first book written in the Bible. You see, wisdom and knowledge can only increase grief. The greater my wisdom, the greater my grief. Increasing my knowledge only increased sorrow, he said. You know, there's the old line, what you don't know can't hurt you. Well, that's sometimes true. But what you know can hurt you too. And as Solomon says here, increase your grief and your sorrow. You know, people who know a whole lot know what can go wrong. I remember listening to Andrew Card one time speak, who was the president, who was the, under President George W. Bush was the, what do they call the guy that's right next to him? Chief of Staff. And he was describing 9/11 and Bush's response to 9/11 and how they flew all over the country trying to figure out where to land him and all. And he said, people just do not realize how close we are on the brink every single day to one little thing going wrong and it creating disaster and chaos. And he said, that's the biggest stress of the Oval Office, is how much can go wrong that people don't know. In other words, to increase knowledge can increase your sorrow. So is ultimate meaning found in knowledge and wisdom? No, Solomon said it's not, and he was the wisest man who ever lived. Well, how about pleasure? Is ultimate meaning found in pleasure? And so chapter 2 is, the whole chapter is looking for love and pleasure in all the wrong places. I said to myself, come on, let's try pleasure. Let's look for the good things in life. But I found that this too was meaningless. So I said, laughter is silly. What good does it do to seek pleasure? So we tried fun and games and laughing and pleasure. Didn't work. Then he tried wine. After much thought, I decided to cheer myself with wine. And while still seeking wisdom, I clutched at foolishness. In this way, I tried to experience the only happiness most people find during this brief life in this world. Have a laugh. Have a glass of wine, try to find the only happiness most people find in this brief world. It's almost like he was living last week, is it not? It's almost like he was living last week, because that's where people look for happiness and meaning as well. Did not find it there either. Anything I wanted, I would take. Can you imagine being in such a position? Wealthiest man in the world, wisest man in the world, and most powerful kingdom in the world at the time. Woo! Can you imagine being in their position and saying, anything I wanted, I would take? I denied myself no pleasure. Do anything I want, have anything I want. Nobody can stop me. Did that bring happiness and joy and meaning and satisfaction? It was all so meaningless. Like chasing the wind. There was nothing really worthwhile anywhere. Today we live in a pleasure-crazed culture too. And it's so important for us to realize this, that you will never find ultimate meaning and satisfaction there. Never. If he couldn't, you can't. I can't. It's impossible. Must we always have the exciting or the spectacular in order to be satisfied? Must we always be entertained or given a thrill a minute in order to be happy. You see, when happiness is dependent upon pleasurable circumstances, it simply cannot last very long, for life is not always a bed of roses and pleasant circumstances. There is, however, happiness and satisfaction that is not dependent on any set of circumstances. And Paul talked about it in Philippians 4. Not that I was ever in need, for I've learned to be content with whatever I have. Now, before I finish that scripture, can I just do this contrast for you in your mind? Here's Solomon over here, wealthiest, wisest, most powerful man in the world, in the prime of his life, denied himself nothing, could have anything, do anything he wanted, tried it all, and said it's meaningless. It's like chasing the wind. Here's Paul over here in prison when he's writing this, the Mamertine prison in Rome, saying, not that I was ever in need, but I've learned how to be content with whatever I had. Never find contentment. I've learned how to be content. I've learned how to live on almost nothing or with everything. I've learned the secret of living in every situation, whether it's with a full stomach or empty or plenty or little, for I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. Woo! One says everything's meaningless, chasing after the wind. The other one says, no, I'm content no matter what. Doesn't matter which one. So is ultimate satisfaction and meaning found in life? Yes. This guy found it, no matter what he had. This guy, we'll see later, was just looking at the time in the wrong place. Let's ask a third question. Is ultimate meaning found in achievement and advancement? Those things are paramount to people in a materialistic culture. Our achievements are so important to us at the time. Our awards, our advancements are so important to us at the time. But over time, the trophies, the plaques, the awards, the ribbons are taken down off the wall and deposited to a closet where they will sit for another 20 or 30 years. And the reason I'm saying this is because we have just done this past week, this very past week. Most of you know we are reorganizing my office here, and I've been giving away books on Wednesday nights and letting people just come to my office and get books, any books you want. We've been putting them out, and I've already given away somewhere near 1,000 books, and we're reorganizing that, and we're setting up a little fellowship counseling area. But one of the things that we ran across was like 15 or so trophies, awards, plaques, and Diane said, what do you want to do with them? And I glanced down at them and I said, throw them all away. Throw them all away. I'm sure they meant something at the time. I really am. I'm sure they meant something at the time. Now they're out in the dumpster at the end of the property over here. You know, just another evidence that awards and achievement and trophies and plaques eventually become chasing after the wind. Solomon said, then I observed that most people are motivated to success because they envy their neighbors. But this too is meaningless, like chasing the wind. Fools fold their idle hands, leading them to ruin. Better to have one handful with quietness than two handfuls with hard work and chasing the wind. That is as good as anything you will ever read in any modern self-help book. It is. Better to be happy and quiet with one handful than two handfuls that you've had to kill yourself for and chasing the wind and none of it matters. It's better to be poor but wise youth than an old and foolish king who refuses all advice. Such a youth could rise from poverty and succeed. He goes on and on to talk about advancement and achievement, and he winds up the same place. It's only found in being content, whatever the circumstances, the same place Paul wound up. Well, is ultimate meaning found in wealth and prosperity? We'd like to think so, but this guy's the wealthiest man in the world. Remember back when 2 Kings in our study about 2 months ago, when the Queen of Sheba came to visit Solomon, she said, "The half have not been told." I just can't imagine. I've never seen anything like this. This is the most wealth I've ever seen anywhere. His gold alone, more than Fort Knox. It was unbelievable. So surely there's meaning found in that. Nope. The richest guy in the world said, "Those who love money will never have enough." How meaningless to think that wealth brings true happiness. The more you have, the more people come to help you spend it. So what good is wealth except perhaps to watch it slip through your fingers? People who work hard sleep well, whether they eat little or much, but the rich seldom get a good night's sleep. Now, I know a lot of you would love to test that hypothesis, but that is what the guy who was the richest man in the world says. Wealth is never satisfied. Wealth never brings peace. We're always trying to get that one more thing. Those who have money will never have enough, and it doesn't automatically solve problems or bring the peace and rest of sleep. You know that's true because we have never in the history of the world had more sleep problems than we have right. You cannot turn on the television without seeing an advertisement for some kind of a sleep aid. You can't. And we're the most materialistic, wealthiest country of all time, and nobody can sleep. Nobody can sleep. Why? Exactly what Solomon wrote in his journal 3,000 years ago. Now, financial prosperity, nothing wrong with that, can be legitimately earned and used appropriately, can be the very blessing of God, but it will not by itself bring ultimate satisfaction and meaning. Now, in chapter 3, those are the first 2 chapters. In chapter 3 becomes a very practical passage of Scripture in the first 11 verses that are leading somewhere. But many of us of a certain age group will remember it as a #1 pop hit song by the Byrds because they are word for word. They are word for word from the 60s, I meant to say. But they are word for word the words of the first 11 verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 3. To everything there is a season, a time for every activity under heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, plant, time to harvest, time to kill, time to heal, all the way down. The point being, there is a time for everything. And get this, time is the one great equalizer. Wealth is not an equalizer. Wisdom is not an equalizer. Some people just have more and better brain cells. Knowledge is not an equalizer. Talent is not an equalizer. There are very few equalizers in life. Physical genes are not an equalizer. So I could go on and on with all the things that are not equalizers. Your background, your training, your family history. You didn't ask to be born, so you were born either, according to the world's timeline, just above or just below other people. Almost no equalizers. But this one is, and that's the point of Solomon's journal here in chapter 3. Time is the great equalizer. Whether you are the president of the United States or living under a bridge in Fort Myers, you have the same 24 hours deposited in your time account every single day. And as Solomon pondered that, as he pondered time, in perhaps the most lyrical and oft-quoted passage in the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, his conclusion to that was, God is in control of the life cycle. There's a time to be born, there's a time to die. So we should trust God to make everything happen in His will in His own right time, and we should assist Him with doing that in our lives. And then He's going to change directions altogether. After all this cynicism, He's going to turn around in chapter 9 and suggest that you should enjoy life while you can. That it's the simple things in life that really matter. So go ahead, eat your food with joy and drink your wine with a happy heart, for God approves of this. Wear fine clothes with a splash of cologne. Live happily with the woman you love through all the meaningless days. He's got to get a little of that cynicism back in, even in the middle of the joy, doesn't it? Through all the meaningless days of life that God has given you under the sun. The wife God gives you is your reward for all your earthly toil. And then whatever you do, do well. In the NIV, in the old King James Version, it says, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your heart. Or do it with all your might. So that's a great verse. If you're a parent or a grandparent in here this week, and you're going through Love Your Bible with your kids or your grandkids at home through the week, as I know many, many of you are doing, this is a great place to pull over and park for a while and go over that verse with your child or grandchild. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. That's what really matters. It's the simple things in life that matters the most. Help them to understand whatever you're doing, do it right. I didn't have a lot of rules with my kids, but I had 2 or 3. You couldn't quit doing something until you had done your best to try to make it happen. You couldn't quit an athletic team if you started on it. You didn't have to start on it, but if you started practicing and you started playing, you could not quit. You had made a commitment. If you're working on a project, you have not done everything you can do until you have asked me or your mom or somebody else to help you with it. But you cannot just stop doing it. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. And here's what I find interesting as you go up here and you look at these two verses right here. These 2 verses right in the middle. Isn't it strange that the man who had at least 1,000 women in his life, 700 wives and 300 concubines, would recommend loving but one faithfully? Just think about that for a second. Now, some of those marriages were political marriages. In fact, most of them were political marriages for political alliances with a king. He'd make an alliance with a king, and the king would say, well, to make sure we both keep our end of the deal, you marry my daughter, and there we go. So some of them were political, but not all of them. Not all of them. But I just found it so fascinating that a man that had 1,000 women in his life would recommend just loving one. You know what I think? Can't prove this. It's what I think. Perhaps Solomon had one really great love in his life, maybe the subject of the Song of Songs that we're going to look at in just a few minutes. But he took that love for granted and allowed his relentless pursuit of pleasure to destroy the one relationship that could have been the most satisfying in his life. At any point, he finally gets to the end, the conclusion of the matter, and 28 times in Ecclesiastes he says, life is meaningless. Everything is meaningless. And there's nothing new under the sun. It's like chasing after the wind. So he devotes all of his life to a search for ultimate meaning and satisfaction. And after trying so many options that didn't bring him fulfillment, he then, in the last chapter of the journal, says, don't let the excitement of youth cause you to forget your Creator. Honor Him in your youth before you grow old and say life is not pleasant anymore. If you remember the old King James, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. But the real conclusion of the story is in verses 13 and 14, among the last verses in the book. That's the whole story. That's the whole journal. Here now is my final conclusion. Fear God and obey his commandments, for this is everyone's duty. God will judge us for everything we do, including every secret thing, whether good or bad. There's no value in wasting your life on a search for something that isn't there. So begin in your youth remembering your Creator, and you'll save yourself a lot of time and money and heartache. It was Robert Louis Stevenson, who said, no one is a success until he writes at the top page of his life, enter God. Solomon would agree. Any other search for lasting meaning and satisfaction comes up empty. Let me kind of sum up Ecclesiastes, odd book. Ecclesiastes reads like a convoluted schizophrenic book if you read it like an essay or a sermon. I mean, 1 minute Solomon is saying life is meaningless, and the next he's saying we should enjoy life, right? 1 minute Solomon seems to be saying work is useless, and the next minute he seems to be saying we should all work hard with all of our might, right? 1 minute Solomon is saying life makes no sense whatsoever, and the next minute he's telling us exactly how to make sense out of life. Keep in mind, you are reading the honest, heartfelt journal confessions of a man struggling with doubt and disillusionment and despair, who in the end comes to the right conclusion of that. You cannot read Ecclesiastes like you read any other book in the Bible. Most of the other books are history or describing events. Ecclesiastes is like a lifelong journal with honest feelings and thoughts, so it has to be read a bit differently. Some people have suggested Solomon was going what we sometimes call a midlife crisis, a period of discouraged reflection when you look at where you've been and what you've done with your life, and you don't really like what you see. And to add to his disillusionment, he looked ahead and he saw more of the same coming, and it's all meaningless. But Solomon doesn't seem to focus solely on his own personal feelings. He seems to be speaking for all humanity when he said, generations come and generations go, and the earth never changes. So to that degree, he's also talking to us. So try to understand Ecclesiastes in its context, taken on the whole. Don't let isolated verses contradict other truths when taken out of their context. Let's talk a little bit about Song of Solomon. Song of Songs is a love poem, and it describes all the secret intimacies of married love without becoming obscene. Yet the language is undeniably sensual and intimate. And one of the chief purposes of the book is to present a healthy view of intimacy and physical love within marriage. Some of us in here are old enough to remember, and those of us who are not old enough to remember surely have seen on TV shots of the first moon landing and the first man walking on the moon on Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong. And probably most of you, I'm going to ask you right now if you know, what his very first words were when he stepped. How many of you think you know what the very first words were a man said when he stepped on the moon? Raise your hand. All right, if you know it, think you know it, say them out loud. Well, that was like speaking in tongues, I'm telling you what. You'd get about half the answer right from some people and different things. What he actually said was, that's one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind. And I think a handful of you got that right, and others had the words all over the place, but still had the same translation. Well, when he walked back there, on the moon to re-enter the lunar vehicle after the first time he'd been out on the moon, he said into the microphone, "Good luck, Mr. Gorski." And nobody knew what in the world he meant. So there was a mad scramble to find out, what does that mean? And they thought he might, because it was Gorski, they thought he might be referring to some Soviet cosmonaut or someone like that. But checking it out, they found the Soviets had no one connected with their space program named Mr. Gorski. And people for years would ask Neil Armstrong who Mr. Gorski was, but his only answer was just smile. He would never give an answer, he just smiled. Years and years went by, would never answer the question. In 1995, he was at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, and a newspaper reporter, remembering after interviewing him about the moon landing, what it's like to be the first man on the moon, all that, asked him, "Mr. Armstrong, would you mind telling us now this thing you said about Mr. Gorski?" And he smiled like he always did, and he finally said, "I can tell you now because Mr. Gorski recently died. I wouldn't have ever said it before he died." But when I was a little boy out in the Midwest in 1938, a buddy and I were playing ball out in the backyard, and I hit the ball over to the next neighbor's yard, and that was Mr. Gorski's yard. And as I bent over to pick up the ball, which had landed beneath the open window of the Gorski's bedroom, I heard Mrs. Gorski say to Mr. Gorski, "Sex? You want sex? You'll get sex when the boy next door lands on the moon." Good luck, Mr. Gorski, as he steps back onto the lunar module. But according to the Word of God, and especially according to the Song of Solomon, that's not the way sex was intended by God. Now, there are three major interpretations of this book. One is an allegorical interpretation. In fact, many Jewish rabbis viewed it as a poem and an allegory presenting the divine lover and Jehovah and his beloved bride, Israel. And they taught that the poem celebrates a spiritual love, and it was read publicly at the Passover feast, which celebrates Jehovah's choice of Israel to be his spouse. And they will say, those who say it's an allegory, say it's similar to in the New Testament, Ephesians chapter 5, where the bride of Christ the church is the bride of Christ to Jesus. I think it's highly unlikely it's an allegory. There's no hint at all itself in the song that it is an allegory. Doesn't seem right. Typical interpretation is the second interpretation. It says that the song presents the courtship and marriage of Solomon with the background essentially historical and the words literal. So, in other words, mystical meaning for every detail is not required in an allegory. The love of Solomon and his bride is typical to the love between Christ and his church. The love in marriage between a man and a woman is typical to the love between Christ and his church and what is expressed in the Song of Solomon. I think that's unlikely too. I think the historical interpretation is the dominant interpretation, and it is the one that I also hold, and that sees it as a literal love song used to praise faithfulness in marriage, a historical record of the romance between Solomon and a Shulamite woman, because that's mentioned several times in the text. This was a darker-skinned woman. God created man and woman and established and sanctioned marriage, so he included a book in the Bible that gives his endorsement of that. His endorsement of what happened in Genesis chapter 1. And what an endorsement it is. Because did you know you would have to rate this, if you were rating Song of Solomon as a movie, you'd have to rate it PG-30? Not PG-13, PG-30. Because the Jews in ancient times wouldn't let a man read it until he was 30 years old. That's the truth. And Jewish elders didn't worry about the women. They wouldn't let the women read it all, but they didn't worry about that because unfortunately most of them couldn't read. It is a very erotic poem, would have adults only attached to it back in the time before Christ. As a result, you don't hear many sermons from this book, do you? Because frankly, it's too frank for kids in the audience. You've got a man and a woman in love, graphically and explicitly praising the physical features of each other and disclosing their shared fantasy about making love. And their words are not vulgar or obscene, but they are unapologetically sensual and intimate. When I was writing this lesson, I tried using a couple of the terms used at home on Diane, got nowhere whatsoever. I mean, nowhere, got chuckled at, in fact. See, the Bible's not like any other book in the Bible. This book is not like any other book. Not even close. Many godly people have argued it shouldn't even be in the Bible. But because it's there, we have a beautiful reminder that human sexuality is a gift from God. Because it's there, we have a model for romance. And most of the model for romance is built on the language that the bride and the bridegroom speak to each other. Because Song of Songs is primarily two lovers communicating. If you want to know what it really is, it's about providing a model for loving communication in marriage. Well over half the verses in the song are spoken between the two loves. Any marriage counselor worth his grain of salt or her grain of salt will tell you that frequent positive communication is the vital component of a successful marriage. And they say some very intimate things to each other. I have entered my garden, my treasure, my bride. I gather myrrh with my spices and eat honeycomb with my honey. I drink wine with milk. O lover and beloved, eat and drink deeply of your love. My head is drenched with dew, my hair with the dampness of the night. Verse 10 says, my lover is dark and dazzling, better than 10,000 others. Song of Songs 1:8, be wise for husbands to learn from. If you don't know, O most beautiful woman, he refers to her as, O most beautiful woman. Throughout the song, they have pet names for one another, which is common in healthy marriages. My beloved, my dove, my lover. I tried that one too. I tried calling Diane my dove. That didn't work. It's just, all this stuff worked for Solomon, just has not worked for me yet. But they're personal pet names that communicate to your mate that you are unique. They're names we don't use for anybody else. Good communication in marriage is personal communication in marriage. It just is. How positively they speak to each other is what blew my mind. There's no negative, nothing whatsoever. He called her beautiful here. Another place, he called her my perfect one. My perfect one. Now, of course, we know that since she was human, she could not be perfect, but that's what he called her, which calls to mind the old saying I've told many people in counseling, you'll always catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. Some of you should try it. He calls her here the most beautiful of women. All men could learn from verse 15. How beautiful you are, my darling, how beautiful your eyes are like doves. Now, to update the language, like I said, the doves thing didn't get me far. But update the language, but the principle is the same. It was passionate. Their words are not vulgar or obscene, but they are unapologetically intimate and romantic and sensual. You are altogether beautiful, my darling, beautiful in every way. Your love delights me, my treasure, my bride. Your lips are as sweet as nectar. Honey and milk are under your tongue. Your clothes are scented like the cedars of Lebanon. They must have had some of those early scent things that you put in the washer and the dryer. Cedars of Lebanon would be pretty cool. But what I'm simply saying to you is the language of love is clearly spoken here. Just reading the words can read like a poem and can be enchanting. So imagine the power they would have when spoken by the one you love. I love this one, probably my favorite one, about the commitment in marriage, is in chapter 8, verses 6 and 7. Hang my locket around your neck, wear my ring on your finger, helpful for where these concepts come from. Love is invincible, facing danger and death. Passion laughs at the terrors of hell. The fire of love stops at nothing. It sweeps everything before it. Flood waters can't drown love. Torrents of rain can't put it out. Love can't be bought. Love can't be sold. It is not to be found in the marketplace. Is that not a beautiful way to describe true love? One last question, I'll close. Why is a song about sex and intimacy in the Bible? I would turn the question around and ask, why not? It's such a powerful force in our lives. Wouldn't you expect the Bible to speak on that kind of powerful force? After all, if you don't get a single thing I say all day, get this. After all, sex is not something you do. It is something you are. Innately, male or female, only. It is not something you do. It is something you are. A male or female. You used to go in and fill out a application or an airline or anything else you were going, and it would say, and it would have the word sex. And you didn't put on there the last time you had sexual relations. You checked either the M or the F. Now, I don't know if you've done that in a while like I did this week. You now have about 8 categories you can check. You know what I did? I drew a squiggly line from the bottom one all the way up to the M and then checked the M. I'm going to do it every single time because that's science. Sex is not something you do. Sex is what you are. And God created us as sexual beings and gave us the outlet for expression of those in marriage, and Song of Solomon is an expression of that. My question would be, why not? Why shouldn't it be in the Bible? I'm glad it is.